Good evening. I'd like to call this meeting to order. This is a regular meeting of the Jamestown Public School Board. It is Monday, September 18th at 5:15 in the Thompson Community Room. I'd like to welcome all those in the audience this evening. Please join me in the Pledge of Allegiance. I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all. Does the board want to declare any conflicts of interest this evening? Any conflict of interest with the agenda tonight? Okay, moving on. School board norms. Melissa, see you have yours behind her. Yep, there you go. Would you read those for us, please? Thank you.
The board-developed norms are to share and respect opinions and speak with a unified voice once a decision has been reached, execute all duties of the school board in compliance with the North Dakota Century Code, properly prepare for meetings, commit to assessing board effectiveness, and ensure high-quality governance for all stakeholders.
Thank you, Melissa. We have no public communication. Moving on to the consent agenda. At any time, a board member can remove something from consent agenda. It does not need a second. Is there anything you'd like removed? As you look through there, anything you'd like removed? If not, is there a motion? Motion by Jamie. Is there a second? Second by Dan. We have a motion, a second for the consent agenda. Any discussion? Any discussion? There being no discussion, assuming roll call vote, all those in favor say aye. Aye. Opposed, same sign. Motion approved. Moving on to our regular agenda under recognition. We have several people in our district we'd like to recognize this evening. Jason, would you read off those recognitions?
Gladly.
And then as your name is called, please come over to this table. And Dr. Luck, would you take the pictures?
Yes.
Okay.
So as Dr. Larson stated, these are our 25-year of service to JPS recognees. Mike Solis, Lynn Kosel, Debbie Krebs, Phil Kraber, and Laura Weiss.
One, two, three. Okay. Thank you all.
Yes, I'd like to thank all of you for your dedication to our district and hope for many more years. Moving on, under correspondence, we did receive a card from Casey Schlafman and the Fry family. Under reports, student council report. Please come up and state your name.
My name is Gabby Tweeten, and I am Executive President of Student Council at Jamestown High School. This year, our mission is to get the school involved and work together. And we have two new advisors this year, Ms. Lund and Mr. Smith, and I want to thank them for taking on this role. We started off this year making a few changes because the Student Council was in need of money. So we coordinated a senior sunrise the morning of the first day of school. Seniors were able to purchase parking spots that they could reserve for the year and paint them, and so far they are looking great. We also helped with freshman orientation, and the first day of school we made teacher appreciation gifts for all the staff at the high school. We also wrote letters of encouragement for those staff members at the high school before the first day of school. We got donations from Smile Studio and JRMC with those gifts. This week is homecoming, so this far we have been planning all things homecoming, such as dress-up days, the pep rally, and the dance, and also the parade. And something new with the parade this year, businesses can pay for a spot in the parade for $25. And if you have any questions, there's a link posted on the community page in Facebook. And I also wanted to thank our high school principals, Mr. Heiner and Mr. Beta, for their support. They have been good about helping us get things done.
Thank you, Gabby. Any questions? Diane?
I just wanted to thank you for a great job of, announcing everything. And also, I really appreciate you appreciating the teachers. What I've learned on the school board over these years is that we cannot thank them enough, and the staff. So thank you for doing that.
Thank you.
Any other questions or comments? Thank you, Gabby. We appreciate you taking time out of your evening to come share that with us. Great information. And for Board Education, the political competency budget hearing, we're going to hold that at 6 o'clock. So whenever 6 o'clock comes around, we will just take a break from our agenda and move into that. For now, let's move on to the superintendent's report. Dr. Leck.
Thank you. You have my written report here. I will go through this and some items in greater detail. The first item I have in my report is the availability for JPS busing for other entities. In the past, we have been fortunate in Jamestown Public Schools. We've had space on the bus that has allowed us to partner with other entities when busing is needed in those entities as well. Unfortunately, as the board is aware, we don't have that level of flexibility anymore, unfortunately, at least not to the same degree. We've had pretty significant costs, about 55% in transportation costs related to our last bid from our bus contractor, and that's provided pretty limited capacity for us. That 55% increase relates to a fixed cost per route, which was significantly increased. The addition of a total cost per fuel in the past, that was embedded as part of our route. That was not a separate cost. Now we pay the total cost for fuel and then for activities as well. And so the result from that is we need to be responsible to our public, and we've had to try to find as many efficiencies as we can possibly find. While we are fortunate that we have some space that we can share, it's just not open to the same degree that it was in the past. Additionally, as we reviewed routes, there were two real criteria that stuck out to us. We need to consider the impact of our rider times. When we consider the rider time, it is the longest rider. How long is that route for the longest rider? And then we also had to think about capacity and what is bus capacity. And we defined that as 2 seats on a bus. Sometimes when we have youngsters, they're quite small and they can fit. And other times, 1 rider is enough for 1 seat. So we looked at 2 riders per seat. So when we looked at our ability to share, it comes down to those 2 criteria, which I think are very common sense oriented ideas. The first, again, being the capacity of the bus, so we don't exceed more than 2 riders in a seat. And the second is that no addition to the route would extend our longest rider beyond 90 minutes. As I talk to school districts, even at that 90-minute range, that's on the high side for what is generally looked at for ridership. And so we feel that stretching that's about as stretched as we can be. The other thing that came up, and it's not written in this report, but that opportunity hasn't been available in the past for all. It was just for some other non-Jamestown Public School entities. And if we're going to look at this, it really comes down to equity and fairness and providing that to all, allowing that all would have that opportunity to fill those remaining seats that are available. And I will be honest, it is not very many. As you look at our routes, the capacity is less of an issue than the time. Getting to that 90-minute time frame is that's a lot of the routes that we're running right now are really pushing at that 90-minute area, and that's a concern. The one thing I didn't reference with the 2 riders per seat, we have to consider those riders that are JPS students that are not yet registered for the bus, and so we're including a variance in those as well, because we know our winter ridership increases pretty significantly. So we want to make sure that there are spaces available for those students as well. So we did create an application, and that was sent to private schools on the week of September 11th. So we're going to keep that open through September 29th. Once an application is received, we'll review it in central office. And we'll also look at Dietrich's to determine if there is, what the capacity is, what might need to happen in that route. That might be people meeting the bus in certain locations, so it's not extending that time. It might be, looking at what route might be the best one to suit, and it might be a no. We don't have capacity or we don't have time, and that just simply doesn't work. But we're going to be look at each of those applications, fairly and see what it is that we can do. At the end of the day, we want to support, but we have to meet those two criteria first. And again, that for equity of service, we want to provide that to any school that from the, to be fair, if we're doing that, we have to, that school has to be willing to have a proportional cost agreement. We've had that in the past with, at least in the last 2 years, with those that have been bused. And if those schools are interested, then they can send that application out to their families to determine. But the guidance to those other schools would be, if they are not interested in a proportional cost sharing, then they probably shouldn't send it out, because that's a criteria that has to occur. And then if a rider is approved, that's determined on a case-by-case basis based on those criteria. But if there is availability to go on that route or on a route, the family, there would need to be that cost-sharing agreement with the school, and then the individual families would have to make that per-month contribution. But with that, I'm guessing there may be some questions from the board, so I would just pause and stand for questions.
Jason.
Well, I thank you for putting this in the agenda, because I do think there's some clarification. So thank you for that. And I basically have two questions, maybe both for clarification purposes. This is a result of JPS, due to increased costs, making routes more efficient, correct? With those capacity, with those seating and length of riding, the two priorities. It's not because, it's not due to our direct state funding or something like that.
No, it has nothing to do with our state funding. We have always been funded less than what we expend. And I could do a cost analysis if the board is interested in that, but we get significantly less from the state than what we expend.
And when we do include other entities, we're not reimbursed at a higher rate for that, right? That's where you would talk about the cost sharing.
Correct. It's just paying your fair share of that additional cost. So when I've done it in the past, we have eliminated the state funding component of that, and the proportional cost is on the remaining expenditure that we aren't funded for from the state funding, trying to be as fair as possible. And it's only by the seat. It's not, a certain percentage of the bus. It is by the seat, and we try to make it as, really as reasonable as possible.
Any other questions, Melissa?
I'm just curious, is there a cutoff date for other schools to be signing up for that? And I'm assuming that there's just a certain amount, you've said a percentage of the seating that is for the private schools. What happens if we have more of our public school riders that come in during the summer, and do we then displace those private school, or how is that going to work?
That's a great question. That's why we have the variance that we're building in, because if we make a commitment to a district, another school, we make a commitment to that family, I think it would be unfair to tell them in January, I'm sorry, there's no longer a space for you. We would do it for the year. That's why we have a variance, that we're making sure that we save enough seats for those that we know that are riding from the public school, or at least have a reasonable assumption that they are. Right now, at least the last number I got from Dietrich's is that we have about 100 students that haven't responded back, or that we're still looking to see, are they going to be riding? So there's a chunk that are still, we're uncertain on where they stand, and they may be driving now or things like that. But there's still some students that we want to get information from. But if we make that commitment to a family, that's going to be for the year, and then we'll have to reassess every year.
Any other questions? All right. And thank you, Dr. Lutt. I know you've had communication with the schools and working out this opportunity. Even though we have limited space, I appreciate you doing what we can do to help those families out. So I do appreciate that.
Yeah.
Any
And
other-
there's one question I didn't answer from you. Well, that's the deadline, September 29th.
Yeah.
Yep, and that's in that communication. And we have had one school that has said, yes, they want to participate, and we have not heard back from others. And, we just wanted to make sure that the offer was there, just to be fair.
Anything else? If not, we continue on.
Okay, moving down on my agenda, Jamestown jobs. I told you last time we were here that Emily Bivens and Warren Abrahamson came, joined Cindy Wall in the food service. I have had a chance to watch that video. I think it's great. I think Emily and Warren did a fantastic job, and Cindy did as well, representing the position and the staff over at Roosevelt. On September 27th, that link will drop. I'd share it to you now, but they would prefer to be able to do that on their own. So that'll drop on September 27th. I'm very thankful for our food service program, but also for Chamber of Commerce for taking on and giving a little bit of notoriety to that position. In the past, I believe I talked about an online agreement that we are recommending for approval that has to do with case management services. At the high school, we are short-staffed in special education at that level. This service would take some of the workload burden from them due to case management and paperwork. And so we're hoping that some of those shifting responsibilities allow them more one-on-one time with students. And if this is effective, this might be something that we want to look at other levels as well. This is specific to the shortage at the high school, but it is a good opportunity to check to see if this pilot program works. We know that we are struggling with recruitment and retainment in special education, and one of the burdens that we see is paperwork. And if we can decrease the impact of that paperwork on the day-to-day operation, the day-to-day responsibilities of one of those special ed teachers, maybe we can recruit and retain a little bit better. I think there's a long-term implication to this pilot that I think is really a wise use of the dollars. One thing I will point out, though, is this pilot will have no impact on the general fund. The behavioral health grant, Heidi Badeau, our special ed director, has agreed to cover that through their behavioral health grant. So we'll get a chance to see that in action without a cost to the general fund. So we're very appreciative of that. One other area that I'm sharing as it relates to some of the online agreements that we will be recommending is, we have a shortage of school psychologists as well. We're also exploring a comprehensive data system that would support many aspects of the educational process, including the PLC process that we're asking all of our staff to participate through. This is EduClimber, which is a evidence and goal tracking service. It would allow us to look at a lot of the data that we have in one location, kind of like a data management service, help us with tracking students that are at risk, help us with gathering information in one place, and really being able to, instead of spending a lot of time analyzing data, the reports would exist for our staff and for our school psychologists to use. And so we'll have a little bit more information on that in the future. But I think I was able to see a demo of it. It looks fantastic. Really a good way, a time saver for staff to be able to access that data sharing in a very easy to manage space. If, for those that may have been around, we had something similar, when I first came. We weren't using it. It's something that kind of was a little bit antiquated, and so now this is a much better system that exists and actually is quite a bit less costly as well. But I think there's two real reasons for that: school psychologist shortage, but also the PLC process and our ability to use that data, all of that data that we collect in a much more efficient and effective way. I'm sure I butchered that, and Mr. Gaylor is looking at all the ways he would have explained that better, but I think it's a good system that we really should be looking at piloting in the near future. The Communications Committee meeting, we met on September 6th. If you remember, that is, the Communication Committee is established through our negotiated agreement that includes a board member, Dr. Larson, myself, 2 teachers. We meet based on, as needed, but based on agenda topics that are determined by both the Education Association and the district administration or school board. So we met on September 6th. Our primary topic for meeting was North Dakota Century Code 15.1-09-33.1. If you may remember, that was House Bill 1178, which had to do with the allowance for in-district incentive bonuses. We wanted to look at, what are the benefits of something like that? Trying to look objectively at this allowance. And is it something that we wanted to pursue? What were the benefits of doing such a thing? What are the downfalls? What might an incentive need to be? What are implications that the board should consider for going down that road? I thought we had a very rich dialogue on this topic, and I appreciated the candor in the discussion that we had related to it. I also had a similar conversation with administrators and led a discussion with their Teacher Leadership Academy as well, and really all kind of came to the same place. Great idea, tough to apply, but we'll continue to talk about it, and we just don't want to leave any stone unturned as it relates to how we compensate our people. And so it's something we'll continue to talk about, but we really struggled with how that would impact culture, how that would be applied in a way that was reasonable and fair. Everybody agreed, great idea. Not really sure how it fits in, but we'll continue to have those conversations. We're certainly appreciative of the legislature to provide flexibility, but it may not be the thing for us, at least not right now. We also had discussion, actually the first thing that was brought up by the Education Association, just an appreciation for how the school year has started. The messages that were sent at the beginning of the year, all of our new hires and the administrative fits at all the levels, and just an appreciation for how well the year has started, how positive the school year has been, which we appreciated hearing certainly. There was a question on the status of the board resolution from negotiations, and we just shared that it's going to be a board item in the near future and that there was still a commitment to it. There was a question related to overtime, and we just clarified that overtime is initiated by building principals to central office. We review that request and approve them as needed. We generally don't turn them down, those opportunities for overtime down, because we're short-staffed, and so it doesn't make sense to decline those opportunities when we have things that need to get done in our buildings. So that was clarified. The last thing related to virtual learning, and specifically how it impacts our support staff. It was agreed that, by all parties that were there, that we hope that this last winter isn't replicated at any time in any of our educational careers, that we want to see that level of inclement weather occurring again. We kind of clarified what virtual learning looks like, why or how we structure that we have that grace day. We make up days, then we looked at virtual learning, although that could look a little differently depending on the inclement weather, but that's generally speaking how we like to operate. But the biggest concern related to our support staff, and we really saw a lot of challenges on how to provide makeup time. That was a struggle. I think I shared that with the board in the past, how we do that. We went through a few different iterations of what that looked like. None of them are probably how we wanted to do it. We just didn't anticipate having 4 days off in 2 different instances, but the board needs to be aware that was a huge financial impact to our support staff. And the Education Association really wanted to reinforce to us that they would prefer that those staff members are paid. Our past practice has been allowance for makeup time, and we just need to figure out which of those 2 solutions is the right solution. Like I said, the JEA wanted to be firm that they wanted those staff, whether they came in, make up that time or not, that it was compensated time. We have prioritized opportunities for makeup. Like I said, I think you can look at both of those solutions and say they're both reasonable. Districts do it different ways. There isn't one stock way that districts do this, but there was just concern that makeup doesn't always work out. From the central office perspective, it's tough. When you have some that are asked to come in and work and others that are not. So just being fair and finding a balance between that is, I think, going to be a challenge that hopefully in my career I never have to worry about again, because we'll never experience inclement weather like we had and get into days of virtual learning again. So that is, I'm just going to pause to see if there's questions related to this.
Are there
Okay.
any questions from the board?
I had a question on the online, and I lost my, sorry, the agreements for, tele services. I think that's indicative of where education is going in general, so I'm glad to see that we're, researching and utilizing. And then I was looking at the one sheet that had some of the breakdown of the costs and the on-site responsibilities versus the off-site responsibilities. And then I noticed on there it said like collect on-site data, or collect, the folks managing the case far away would collect data. Is that going, and I bring that up specifically because I've been kind of on the reverse side of this too. When things like this are implemented, it actually ends up adding more to a teacher's or staff member's plate, as if they would, instead of them just doing it themselves. Did that make sense? And so I would envision like, or your vision might be the instructional coach doing that. I mean, I just want to make sure we're aware that adding these, what seem to be, not shortcuts, that's the wrong word, but time savers, because I've been way on the other end of those things where it's actually added more to the employee's plate.
I would hope that's not the case, but that's why we're piloting. Right. We'll have a chance to see if it works or not. One of the other things that I think is interesting about the connection of these last two topics, the online agreement, or the agreement for online supports or virtual supports, and the bonus, the incentive bonuses, is that really this might be one of those solutions where incentive bonus is the wrong allocation of resource. Really the issue at hand, at least in special education, might be paperwork. That's a significant derailer. Maybe the resources are better spent, and this was actually a comment that came up in our Teacher Leadership Academy. Maybe those resources are better spent on things like this that lessen the burden, as opposed to the incentive bonus that may or may not attract individuals. The other issue with incentive bonuses that was discussed at every level was that it doesn't recognize the people that have been there and are still there in those positions, and how that could impact the culture, because they are incentive bonuses, they're not retention bonuses. So I think those two issues fit together, but hopefully I answered your question. Yep. Okay. I did, yeah. And again, like I said, I just want to reiterate the point with support staff, that the Education Association's concern was that those support staff members should be paid regardless. In the past, we have allowed makeup time. So figuring out what the solution is to that is probably our next step that I hopefully never have to deal with again. Transmission line, I just included, we'll come up in the budget hearing in just a little bit, how the impact of in lieu taxation impacts our school funding model. But just to bring awareness to, there is a transmission line that is being proposed between Jamestown and Ellendale. For our in lieu taxes, 75% of that's deducted. We keep 25, or the value of 25% of that. So just to bring awareness that there is a collaborative project between Otter Tail and MDU that's coming through in a transmission line. I wanted to draw attention to the Jamestown Middle School. They were recognized by JRMC for Pillar of Giving recognition, for giving penny drive contributions to JRMC's Cancer Center, which we're very thankful for. Every year I get to spend time in the middle school when they do their assembly to give, and it's just it's always amazing to me to see the passion from the staff and from the kids when they give. And I asked Mr. Stillwell to give a little information for me. In 26 years of the Penny Drive, almost $200,000 have been given to those in need in Jamestown. I think that's really a wonderful, it's a wonderful program, but it's a wonderful experience for those kids to have, to see what giving means. And those individuals come to the assembly and they get a chance to personalize what that giving looks like. And I think that's a very powerful experience for kids and for adults too. The Wilson and Eagles Arena Agreement, that's a $250 annual increase. That's been very consistent. That'll come up later in your agenda. And I just wanted to make a note, my last point is on our draft final budget that has been reviewed and recommended for approval by the Finance Committee. One of the areas we did talk about was the school resource officer vehicle, and that is up for agenda topic that was tabled in the past. And that was recommended to include that cost, so that cost is included in our final budget. That will be reviewed today. It won't be approved because we have our budget hearing today and we want to provide an opportunity for comment before we do that final approval. But just a reminder and a recognition that the Finance Committee did recommend approval for that final budget that includes the school resource officer vehicle. So with that, I stand for any other questions.
Any other questions from the board? Melissa?
Not a question, just wanting to give a thanks out to the people that worked on that budget, that they were proactive in including that into the budget so that we could hopefully move forward with that. So thank you for doing that.
Thank you, Melissa. Any other questions, comments? Dr. Leck with his report. Okay. If not, moving on in our agenda, we have nothing under old business. Under new business, we have nothing under activities or buildings and grounds or curriculum assessment and instruction. Moving on to number 4, finance. A, approval of the 2023 to 2024 Wilson and Eagles Arena Agreement with Park and Recreation in the amount of $29,750. I want to remind the board that this is a $250 annual increase to this. Is there a motion? Motion by Dan. Second by Gail. We have a motion and a second for approval of the 2023 to 2024 Wilson and Eagles Arena Agreement with Park and Recreation in the amount of $29,750. Any discussion? Any discussion? There being no discussion, Chrissy, let's do a roll call vote on this if you're ready.
Melissa Gleason? Yes. Diane Hansen? Yes. Jamie Bear? Yes. Heidi Larson?
Yes.
Jason Rohr?
Yes.
Gail Nelson? Yes. Dan Tweeten?
Yes.
Okay. Motion approved. Thank you. Moving on to our agenda, B, approval of 2023 to 2024 agreement for special education case management service. This is the online service that Dr. Leck talked about. Is there a motion? Motion by Melissa. Is there a second? Second by Jamie. We have a motion and a second for approval of the 2023 to 2024 agreement for special education case management services. Any discussion? Any discussion? And Dr. Leck, we had some clarification on some of those questions that were asked previously, and those are all in there. Any discussion from the board? If not, assuming roll call vote, all those in favor say aye. Aye. Opposed, same sign. Motion carried. C, we have approval of the school resource officer vehicle purchase. This is on our, do we move forward with this one? Yep. This was on our agenda today because it is a public meeting. We wanted the public to be aware that it may be part of our agenda today, so we put it on the agenda. However, it was tabled at the last meeting, so we're in need of a motion and a second and approval to bring it back to the table for that original motion and second. Item back to the table? All right, we have a motion to move the school resource officer vehicle purchase item back to the table by Melissa. Is there a second? Second by Dan. So we have a motion and a second for approval of the school resource officer vehicle purchase to be brought back to the table. Any discussion at this point on that particular motion of bringing it back? Okay. If not, assuming a roll call vote, all those in favor say aye. Aye. Opposed, same sign. Motion carried. Now that it's back on the table, the motion itself already had a motion and a second to it. And so just want to remind the board of that. Discussion. And I see Officer Geisler is in the audience tonight, and we appreciate your interest in coming back. And I'm sure if there's any questions, we could ask that. Dr. Leck first, and then Jason.
If I may, there was discussion on the memorandum of understanding, and I have been working with JPD already to draft or to update the memorandum, and a revised MOU would need to come to the board for consideration anyway. We're talking about ownership, annual costs, assurances of school resource officer. Those, I think, were the three topics that I brought up that I wanted inclusion. They have to have an attorney review. I'll look at it. We may need to have an attorney review, but I think these are things that we can work out. But we've already begun to have those conversations, assuming that this is affirmed. But sorry, one more thing to that. I don't think we need that MOU in front of you to act on this request. That would just be something that would give us the direction that we should be expending resources to get that done.
Great. Thank you, Dr. Leck. And I know you've been doing some work in answering questions this week. Jason.
I did have a clarification or a question, and take this for Ed what it is, but why would, this is just for me, why would JPS purchase this vehicle if the city's going to own it and insure it?
It's a commitment to the school resource officer program that we are ensuring that they have the resources that they need to effectively do their job. I would see it as likely being woven into the MOU for this year as an amount related to a contracted service, akin to that, rather than it is for this purchase. It would just be an additional cost absorbed in that year, is how I would envision it working in the MOU, as opposed to the commitment to purchase that for that purpose, if that makes sense.
Right.
Any other discussion? Any other discussion? Okay. So we have a motion and a second for approval of the school resource officer vehicle purchase. And this motion and second is giving this to be put in, it's in our budget already, but it's in the budget. And also setting that money aside for that purpose within our budget, as well as giving Dr. Leck direction to continue the work on that MOU, and then bring that to the board when the city and Dr. Leck and the board are feeling comfortable with the language in it. Does that make sense to everyone? Anyone has questions or concerns about that? Dr. Leck?
The only comment I want to make is we're asking for this approval prior to the MOU because there's a time horizon. Every meeting we wait is just a delay in getting that equipment purchased. So we wanted approval so we could move forward because that timeline is important.
Thank you. And we'll do a roll call vote on this as well. Christy?
Heidi Larson,
Yes.
Jason Rohr,
Yes.
Gail Nelson, Dan Tweeten, Melissa Gleason, Diane Hansen, and Jamie Bear.
Unanimous approval. And thank you again, Officer Geisler, for coming in today in case we had questions. And Dr. Leck, you'll continue to work with the city on that, and that'll take a little time. Yes, Diane.
Speaking of the time horizon, approved, what are we looking at until Officer Geiser is actually driving this vehicle?
Continuation of what we're doing now. Officer Geisler has been able to make that work, and I think he talked last time about having his side-by-side that he's using and other patrol cars if they're available.
How long for the car? I think
Oh,
that's what
sorry.
Jason asked.
Is that not the question you asked?
How long before the car? Yeah.
How long?
Before
A couple of months,
Before we get the car.
correct? About a couple of
No,
months?
I think it was 6 to 8. Yeah. Officer Geisler, please come forward. And
Sorry. Not sure, because there's a strike that's potentially going to happen. But we're thinking past that already, so. But it's my goal to have something that says police in front of the schools, whether it's a side-by-side or a patrol car until it comes in, so. And I did just want to thank everybody for your support. It really means a lot, so.
and
But
thank you for what you do. Jason, go ahead.
Any thoughts on a potential K-9 unit?
Well, I've thrown around the idea of getting one of my own personal dogs certified as a therapy dog. But right now, just the one K-9 unit is the only one we can support at this time. Yeah.
Yep, good question. Any other questions or discussion? Thank you very much.
Thank you so much,
For
everybody.
coming today. Thank you so much. And so it's getting close to our 6 o'clock hour here. We're 2 minutes away. I just want to point out that D is general fund balance for your information, and E is review of the monthly financial reports for your information at any time if you have questions for Christy. Christy has been very busy here this last couple months getting ready for the final budget. With that, it's 5:59. Dr. Leck, public hearing at 6 p.m., and you have some information to share, and I appreciate you laying this out and explaining it to what we need to look at.
Thank you. As maybe when we start, we have a lot of people potentially watching online that may not be here to provide comment or ask questions. If at any time people have questions about the budget, funding, how those things impact the community or just North Dakota education in general, 252-1950. You can always give me a call at central office. Send me an email, robert.leck@k12.nd.us. I'm happy to answer any questions related to this. Again, as it relates to North Dakota and just how public education is funded, or what are our tax levies in Jamestown, and why are they, how we use those dollars, and budgeting in general. I'm always happy to have those discussions. But I think before we have a budget hearing, and I know it doesn't appear right now that we have anybody that will be coming before us to have public commentary, I think it's important to go through some information to answer some questions maybe before they come and provide a layer of capacity and understanding to what our tax levy is, why it is the way it is, and how local taxation and state funding kind of coincide and work together. I don't think you can have a conversation about what that local taxation is without understanding how it intersects with state funding. So I know the board has heard this a number of times, maybe the public has not, but I want to provide at least an overview so people know what kind of questions they should be asking. In terms of budget approval process, there are written or paper copies in the back for those that, if they have interest in them. That electronic copy is provided as well. Again, that's something that people could ask for, and I'd be happy to send. But I just want to touch on these section by section. Budget approval process, we had a preliminary budget that was approved on August 7th. That budget was reviewed on September 13th by our Finance Committee. We're having this hearing September 18th. And we will be looking for a final approval on October 2nd. Just as a reminder to the board, statutory requirement is by October 10th. We need to have that final budget approved. Our hearing requirements, we do have by law a requirement to provide a budget hearing. That wasn't always the case. It used to be only in certain circumstances, or at least over the last 11 years, we've had it regardless. We just feel it's important to have that budget hearing and that opportunity for our public to come in and provide commentary if they so have any related to our budget. But now it's a requirement, but it isn't a question and answer session. It is an opportunity to share perspective. There may be things that we learn from that budget hearing or those questions or commentary that we want to respond to at a later time. But typically speaking, people get 3 to 5 minutes to say, this is what I believe to be the case, and the board considers that. That's why we have a break between this budget hearing and the formal approval. on October 2nd, because you want a chance to consider the commentary that people have shared, if there were to be any or if there is any today. I'm just kind of following along in the budget or the board memo. It's board memo 99 for the sake of posterity. So just looking at our current request in a historical comparison, I think this is a really important section, and one that I think is pretty interesting. If you look from 2013-14, we have been essentially at the same level. There's been a variance of about 2 mills from 13-14 through now. And if you look at a $100,000 home, that's like $9 annually in the school's portion of taxes. On a $100,000 home, that variance of 2 mills, it's a really pretty limited impact. But we have been able to be consistent at that 100 to 102 mills. We're at 102 mills is the proposal for this levy request since 13-14, and I think that shows a commitment to being as efficient as possible in Jamestown Public Schools, and I'm happy to say that we're again asking, maintaining that 102 mills. Again, for the sake of comparison, context, a $100,000 home, that on the current mill levy, that would be $459 on that $100,000 home. I did include, and it's linked in this worksheet, and I can send it to somebody if they would be so interested, a mill calculation worksheet if you want to look at, how is my property tax going to change if my home is reassessed, or if the levy increases or decreases. What is that impact to my home? You can click it. Click in that Excel spreadsheet. It's really pretty easy to work with. If you look at it, you would be changing the mills that are in. I'm trying to remember the colors now that I put in there. I tried to color code them. Taxable value on top, the mills that we're requesting in green columns. So if you wanted to see what would happen if the general fund went from 70 to 60. What if a special assessment was added, something like that? You could add those in, and it would calculate the mills based on your property and the current taxable value. Well, taxable value wouldn't, but it wouldn't impact that. But so you might be manipulating cells in the green. You may also be looking in the blue cells. That's where you could input the value of the cropland that you have that quarter, or your residence, or you could be inputting that number. So if you have a market value of a home that's $250,000, you could just put $250 in there, and it would do the calculations based on all of those. I just think it's a good tool for taxpayers to look at to make those assessments themselves. And I want to reiterate, and I said it earlier, I say it every year at this budget hearing, that doesn't account for reassessments. The school is not, we don't consider if a home has been reassessed and its value was $100,000 and my taxes were based on $100,000, now it's reassessed and it's now $150,000. You told me my taxes weren't going to change. This is an apples to apples comparison, a $100,000 home to a $100,000 home. That's what we're making a comparison for. We don't control reassessment. That's a different responsibility. So these estimates don't provide that, and they aren't intended, and we're not taking over the county assessor's job. We're just giving you a tool to look at that pretty effectively calculates what those taxes would be. I'm going to draw your attention to the table on page 2, which I think is a really important historical context. Sometimes when we look at our taxes, we look at what we paid last year, and that's the only connection that we make. And I think if you really want to look at taxes, you have to look back to 2008, 2009, because that's the year that we first started, the last year that we had 185 mills. People would be surprised if you tell them now, they forget that in 2008, 2009, our total levy was 236. Well, actually 236.4. Were our mills in 2008, 2009. On a $100,000 home, we said now that it's $459. That travel back in time to 2008, 2009, our taxes would have been $1,063.80. There was a few legislative sessions that decreased. They used school funding as kind of a mechanism for property tax relief, and you can agree with that or disagree with that, but that's what happened. And so we think about, our taxes are so high. Well, if you take a look at 8-9, you see what that was. And so still significantly lower. It's hard to imagine, and again, we're not talking reassessments here. We're just talking about an apples-to-apples comparison. It's hard to imagine getting to that point again in our property tax, in the schools portion of property tax. So I think that's a really important chart that you look at just to provide reference. So in 8-9, it was 1,063 compared to 459 now. In 9-10, it was 726.30 compared to 459. And then since 13-14, it's really been between 450 and 459 on that same $100,000 home. So I do think it represents that we're trying to be as efficient as we can in Jamestown. When we have caps and mill levy caps and things like that, we look at trying to be as efficient as we can. And so we're certainly thankful for that, but we're committed to making that, providing a budget that's as efficient as we can make it, and that's as reasonable as it can be. I said at the start that you can't understand local taxation and the impact of local taxation without understanding state funding. They intersect together. I know the board is aware of this, but the public in general may not. I think the message that gets sent is we get a pretty substantial per pupil payment, and that is what we receive from the state. I know the board is aware of this already, but that's not what we get from the state. That's a number, that 10,636. I like to describe it in this way. There's adequacy and equity in school funding. That 10,646 is what is the funding needed to provide an adequate, high-quality education to kids. That's what that number represents. The school district, the taxpayers, have a share in that 10,646. We have a responsibility too, right, to provide a high-quality education for all kids, regardless of their uniqueness. We have a responsibility to provide that adequate education. We share in that cost. That 10,646 includes our cost. It's inclusive of what the state provides. It's inclusive of what we provide. And I would say that 10,646 starts, that adequate education, that amount starts, it next comes to us. We pay our portion of that, and the state subsidizes the difference. And I'll show you in just a second about what that state cost actually provides, or what the state actually provides in terms of local funding. But I think that's the way it needs to be considered. 10,646 is what is adequate. That is what provides a high-quality education, or the funding, the resource that provides a high-quality education to kids. We make a series of adjustments, and they're based on equity, and I'll talk about that in just a bit. But then what remains is what the state pays. And that varies from school to school, from district to district. We're all different. So the state has to provide a different amount. And in almost every district, that number is different, what that actual state payment is. But it's what's standard and the same is 10,646. That's that's the per pupil guarantee, or what I call the per pupil guarantee. For those that are interested, if they've never seen, if you go to the Department of Public Instruction's website, and it's actually linked in this report, and I can send it to anybody that would like it, there's some information that's compiled called Finance Facts. If you've never dug into that as a board member, I encourage you to do that. It provides data all the way back to 1985 related to pretty much any funding expenditure that exists. I think if you like numbers, you like to look at there and you laugh, you chuckle. I do like those things. But I think it's important that you look at how do things compare, right? Where did we come from? How are we spending money? I do think that's important data that we consider. And sometimes we really localize and we say, well, what do we spend? And that matters to us because we're taxpayers, of course, and our kids go to school here. But how does that compare out? Is that higher, lower? What are those expectations in Fargo compared to Jamestown or Grenora? And I think there's really good data that comes from looking at those finance facts. So that's linked in there. Some of the things that I would point out, I do spend quite a bit of time in finance facts, but the state average in the general fund is increasing. It's increasing every year. I've done this analysis. I actually do kind of a school finance or budgeting 101 for new superintendents, and I draw from this data every year. This data is increasing. The commitment, the local contributions are increasing every year. Some of that is our increased costs and our increased requests, which we have to own, right? If we're asking for more money, we need to own that request. But there's another thing that I think is a bigger threat that school boards need to be aware of, and that is the reliance on state funding. And we've talked about that in this board before. There's a reliance on state funding, and there's a limited capacity for us to generate additional revenue. That means that we are beholden to the state. So when the state provides us 0 and 0, as they did a few years ago, or 1 and 1, a few bienniums ago, as they did the last biennium, that means that there is a corresponding increase to local taxation. So when the state doesn't pay their fair share, the local taxpayers pick up the difference. Because remember that, providing that adequate education, that's a shared responsibility. So when the state pays less, we pay more, or the locals pay more. That's shown, I think, really clearly in how the state average in general fund has increased. More schools are at the levy caps or within a mill or two from the levy caps, and that's concerning to me, because in the past, even we didn't like when our tax bills were that 1,063 based on 185 mills, but we had a lot more control. We had ability to mitigate loss from the state. We don't have that anymore. We are really beholden to the state. We're very thankful that the state provided a 4% increase in this biennium and the next biennium. We're very appreciative of that. But I'd be worried if they hadn't, and what these kinds of state averages would look like, and that's a concern to me. So we don't have that ability to mitigate shortfall. I can speak to Jamestown and say I think we've done a nice job managing ESSER funding, which we consider generational funding. We've been able to write grants that when we do want to make investments in literacy, in instructional quality, that we've been able to find other revenue sources for those things. We've done the best that we can. Those are probably two of the best ways I can provide example for that have helped us fill that gap. But I think as boards, as a community, we have a responsibility to check that trend. I'm concerned about that trend and what that means for us in education. So it's something to keep an eye on. I talked kind of about what adequacy and equity are, but I want to define those because we're talking about them as it relates to funding formulas and how school funding operates. So I want you to consider adequacy is about kids. There's a uniqueness to every kid. Some have special needs. Some have a poverty background. Some are talented and gifted. Some are just regular kids. But they all have unique qualities, and funding has to recognize that kids need different things. And so that's where there's a bunch of inputs into our funding formula that recognizes those things. Things like special education, at risk, English learners. All of those are imputed into what denotes adequate funding. So the state does that for us. And I think you could argue with how those are weighted. You could argue with, are they enough? But I think the formula does a really good job of recognizing that not all kids are the same. So adequacy is about uniqueness of kids and making sure that the level of funding that is provides a high-quality education. And that shouldn't matter where you live. It shouldn't matter if you're in Grenora, on the Turtle Mountain Reservation, or in Jamestown. Your access to that funding should be the same. So how you do that is equity. Equity exists because not all school districts are the same. If adequacy recognizes that not every kid is the same, equity recognizes that not all school districts are the same. Consider just a few examples. If you have a large property-rich school district in the Red River Valley, that taxable value is going to be very high. So local taxation, the contribution at a local level is very, very high. Compare that to the Turtle Mountain Reservation that has very little taxable land, and the taxable land it has is not property rich, it's considered property poor. How do you provide an adequate education in those circumstances? One has more and one has much less. And so equity strategies have to exist to balance that difference. It doesn't equalize, it doesn't treat them all the same, it provides equitable examples. It mitigates the difference between those two examples. It also considers, we're very we have energy production in our state that we're all well aware of that is a great boon to the economy of our state. But not every school district is impacted by that in the same way. We don't have that impact in Jamestown, not compared to, say, McKenzie County or Williston or Ray out in the west that sees huge influx of dollars in lieu of taxes. Things like coal, or Beulah, coal severance, coal conversion, oil and gas tax. Before this funding formula is in place, there were kind of winners and losers. Some schools had access to the state fund, well, all schools had access to local taxation and state funding, but then some had extra. Oil and gas tax, coal conversion, coal severance, high land valuations, things like that that made us different. And so equity strategies are put in place in the funding formula to make sure that we're paying our fair share locally. And like I said before, the state then subsidizes the difference. So I think that's an important aspect to understand equity and adequacy and how they feed into the funding formula. So I've linked a few things for those that are interested. A state funding worksheet specific to Jamestown. It's tied to September 2023. And when you look at those deductions, I'm not going to go through all those deductions. If anybody's interested, I am happy to have a conversation with you about it. I've actually linked a few resources in here. If somebody wants a line by line, hey, let's walk through Jamestown's funding formula and I will tell you everything about it. I've included a link in there. I did it for other superintendents that were new to the profession last year, but I think it still corresponds. And if somebody really wants to dig deep, you can get a line by line primer on how the funding formula works and how we make the deductions. But for the purposes of this, I think it's important just to see adequacy, 10.646. There's a series of adjustments that are made to treat schools similarly so we can provide that high quality education to all kids. So if you look at the chart, kind of in the middle of page 3, that shows what we actually receive and what the district actually pays. So 10.646 is that per pupil guarantee for an adequate education. The state assumes a local contribution of 60 mils. I think that's really important. We're asking our public for 102 mils, but the state deducts or accounts for 60 of those mils in the adequate funding. So sometimes people think, well, it's 10.646. You get that plus 102 mils. We do not. That is not what we receive. We receive 10.646 minus 60 mils of that. So about 59% of our request to local taxpayers is actually deducted away from us as our contribution to inadequate education. I don't think people realize that. I think, to be honest, some of our legislators don't understand how that works together, and that's why we have, board education on things like that, because we need to be able to advocate for this reality. It's just complicated. It's not that people are neglecting that information. It's just complicated. It's easy for us to look at 10.646 and assume that times the number of students we have is what the state provides. But we have to be talking about what we actually receive. So if you look at the value of 60 mils out of that 10.646, that's about $2,100, $2,085 subtracted. That's our local contribution based on property, so what we can tax. So that's our contribution. So the other local revenue, that's things like we get a little bit of coal conversion, we get telecommunications, tuition, mobile home tax, things like that that are in lieu of taxation. That's a very small number for us, but we get to keep 75% of that, or I'm sorry, we keep 25% of that. The state assumes 75% of whatever we receive in those in lieu of taxes as our contribution to an adequate education. So if you take that 2,085 plus that 105, you deduct it from the 10.646, that gets us to 84.56. So what does the state actually provide us per student? And it's technically per weighted student unit, but I won't get into the complexity of that. But it's 84.56. That's different for us than it is in Kidder County, than Grenora or Fargo. That number is different, but the formula works the way it's supposed to. And sometimes you'll hear me be critical of certain aspects of the formula. That doesn't mean I don't like the formula. I think the formula works exactly the way it's designed to work, and I think it does exactly what it should do, which is equalize, or make equitable, be fair to all kids, be fair to school districts. I might not like how something is weighted. I might push back on the state to say, you know what, EL students are way underfunded, and they are. But the reality is this formula works really well, and when I'm critical of it, I don't mean to say that our legislators are not giving us the best that they can. I'm simply saying that there needs to be an understanding of what actually is. And so that 10,646, again, is 8456. That's what the state actually, in some schools, it's much, much lower, $2,000, $3,000. And that is because they might have greater contributions in other areas, like oil and gas impacted communities. They have such a large contribution from other local revenue that decreases what the state actually provides. But again, it's standard. There's a question.
So the assumed local 60 mills, that is the same across the state?
Yes, almost. There is a little bit of difference because we have, and I won't get too deep into the weeds here, but there's a 12% growth cap, meaning that you can't tax more than 12% in dollars. And so some of our schools, over time, their taxable value has grown beyond 12% consistently, like out in the West. That's driven down their general fund because they can't levy more. There's contradiction of two pieces of law. You can't tax more than 12%, and you are expected to levy at 60 mil. You're expected to be deducted 60 mils. So what the state has done, and that's eventually going to work its way out, although they're pushing for that to work faster. But essentially what that's meant is that some districts can't levy 60 mils, so they're deducted what they can levy. So if they are able to levy 45 mils, then that's what's deducted. But the rest of us, if we choose to levy below 60 mils, and we can levy 60 mils, we're deducted 60 mils. So it's a disincentive to levy less than 60 for the rest of us, because we'd be deducted it anyway.
The 60 mils, wasn't that at 40 like a couple years ago, or am I thinking of something else?
It was 60.
Okay.
Yeah,
I thought
it's
they
been
had increased.
consistently at 60. My point to our legislators and just superintendents in general, if we could go back in time, this wasn't foreseen. This crazy valuation growth, especially out west, could have never been foreseen when the first iterations of this funding formula were done. If we could have seen it, we would have gone back and said, everybody has to be at 60. And so now we're trying to get back there because we let that issue fester for so long that it got down to a point where some districts were levying like 28 or 30 mils in their general fund because they couldn't go higher. And that created a different inequity that I was frustrated with. But we're getting to the point where everybody will be at 60 and they're deducted 60. But that is, like I said, that's our contribution to that. And I think it's important to recognize when we levy 102 mils, 60 of that we don't see the value of. We see it deducted in a different place. It's kind of like a shell game where we share from one place to another. A last thing that I haven't spent a lot of time, I've talked about it in the past in this budget hearing, is the Common Schools Trust Fund. I did a little data gathering for the board and for the public related to the Common Schools Trust Fund. So if you don't know what that is, the Common Schools Trust Fund is a constitutionally required fund. The purpose of that fund is to financially support public education. It was part of the Enabling Act, so when we became a state, states were required to create a constitution. As part of that constitution, you're required to set aside a certain amount of land every year, a certain number of land in that year with the revenue generated by it to support public education. North Dakota, we're very lucky because we separate mineral rights from property rights in our state. Some of that revenue is generated by the things you might think of from land leases, leasing that land for grazing or for farming. That's some of that. Some of it is sale. Probably a century ago, quite a bit of that land might have been sold. And so we don't have as much of that land anymore, but we have a lot more acres of mineral rights. I think, did I write it down in here? I can't remember if I did or if, no, but I was looking up at it this earlier today. It's something like 600,000 acres of property is still within the holdings of the Common Schools Trust Fund. But 1.5 million acres is devoted to mineral ownership. That was wise. Because with energy expansion in our state, that has generated a crazy amount of revenue in the last 10 years. When I first became a superintendent, I believe the commitment of the Common Schools Trust Fund to our per pupil payment was around $280, $300. Right now, it's $2,142 of that 10,646 is contributed by the Common Schools Trust Fund. That's significant growth in 15 to 20. Actually, that's in 15 years, that's gone from $400 and some dollars, 409, I think, to 2142. That's significant. The hope in the long term, and I know this from talking to legislators, is that we can fund education, the state's contribution, through the Common Schools Trust Fund. If that continues to grow, now you might assume that the Common Schools Trust Fund is simply earnings, but there's a complicated formula that goes into a rolling assumption of what that equates to. And none of that's really important, but the 2142 is. The other reason I bring that up is because you look at the state's contribution. I think you could make a case that that's the Common Schools Trust Fund, and that 2142 is actually a constitutionally required commitment. It's not the state's commitment. It's it might come through funnel through the state, but the general fund obligation is not increasing. It's actually decreasing, the general fund's contribution, because in almost every biennium, the growth of the Common Schools Trust Fund's constitutional commitment outstrips what the state provides. So you actually see a decrease in general fund obligation over time, which I think is pretty interesting when you consider the amount of effort that goes into communicating how much more the state is paying. But it's really the Common Schools Trust Fund that's the largest driver to that. So I thought what would be interesting is if you actually take that Common Schools Trust Fund value out, and then you see what is the state's actual contribution that's not required contribution. So for us, that's 6314, and that's about 59% of what's required to fund an adequate education. So I think those are all just numbers that people should be aware of. I don't think it changes things at the end of the day, but awareness to how we fund, I think, is really important. Like I said, I shared some additional resources in the budget memo. If people would like to see it, has additional resources. It has some definitions and explanations that might help understand some of the things that I talked about. There's that resource that goes line by line through. There's a payment worksheet that I've included. So I think there is some good information in there. But lastly, what does it matter, right? I mean, what are our budget impacts, and what are the future considerations that this board should be looking at? I think declining enrollment is a significant issue that as a community we should at least wrap our minds around. We see the largest declining enrollment at the elementary level. That means that we're going to see that move up into the middle school level. It's not there yet, but it will be. The high school level, our high school is as large as it's going to be for a period of time, at least for the foreseeable future. And I think you could say the same for our middle school. So how are we going to adapt to that new reality? We've looked already, and you know, that has a consideration on the district, and that has a consideration on our budget. What is our budget going to look like, and what does it need to look like? We know that from conversations with our community that we have a facility footprint that's a companion that should be considered jointly as a companion with enrollment. You know, what are our facilities going to look like in 10 years? And I think we need to, as a board, be proactive, and as a district, be proactive about what should that look like, because there are changes coming just based on our enrollment. We know that the primary driver for school funding is enrollment. When we rely on the state on a per pupil funding mechanism, that's a shifting paradigm from where we were. You know, 15, 20 years ago, the determination of school wealth was property, because local taxation was the biggest portion. Now it's state funding, so the biggest driver is enrollment. So when enrollment is declining, that should be warning flags for our community, warning flags for us as a district and the board, and how are we going to plan around that? And I think facilities are as big of a part of that as enrollment. We need to plan around the reality that some of the funding we've been able to mitigate, some of that loss from the state, have been short-term dollars. I think as a district, and I've said this many times, I think we did a really good job managing our ESSER funds. We've built an interim balance that can withstand some of this change. 10 years from now, we'll look back on that and say, well, that was really wise. And I'm glad that we see an interim balance right now that we do see, because we will need it to mitigate some of that change. So that's good, but we need to consider the fact that, comprehensive literacy state development grant, that's going to be going away. We won't have that again unless we write another grant if one exists. ESSER funding, that's generational funding, and those dollars are near an end. I think, again, we've done a good job with those funds, and we've been thinking long-term with those dollars, either with devoting some to facilities or growing the interim balance, and that's been really, really wise. But we have to prepare for the fact that that's not always going to be the case. Staffing shortages are a concern that we need to mitigate around. That's not a surprise. We know that's coming. But education is no different than industry or any business. We're all facing shortfalls, and so how are we going to mitigate around that? So the final budget proposal outlines two things, and this is something we talked about at the Finance Committee. We have to consider what we need to operate, and that budget represents what we need to operate. When we are fully staffed, we see this cost. But it also needs to recognize, what do we anticipate costing? Because we want to be really transparent to the public on that, because what we're probably going to spend is less than what we budget for, because we aren't filling all of our positions. But we have to recognize both, because if we tell our public our budget is at a lower amount, and then we fill those positions and we come back next year, that's going to be recognized as this huge increase. And it really isn't. We're budgeting for what we need to operate. But we have two numbers in there. So that negative 560, 530, that represents what we need to operate. The very close to a balanced budget, so negative 562, 514.65, that represents a total deficit, meaning what do we feel like we need to operate? Our deficit of $40,000, 39, 527.77, that recognizes where we anticipate being. There's positions we can't fill. We know we're not going to fill them, or we find it very unlikely to fill. So we're probably going to be closer to this negative 40,000 number, but we want to be really transparent about both of those numbers, what we anticipate being at and what we feel like we need to operate. And hopefully that makes sense. But staffing shortages are a big issue. But other than that, we're also seeing increased costs related to staffing shortages, extended contracts, services like the one you approved earlier to make it a little bit easier for what happens in those staffing shortages. Things like EduClimber, which is the data warehouse that I talked about earlier, that we'll bring forward in the future to make our data collection and analysis more efficient, so we're spending our time smarter. And those kinds of things. Access to virtual courses is a significant increase in this budget for lots of different reasons, but access to virtual courses, online case management, those are all things that have seen increases in our budget that we also have to recognize. A staff shortage doesn't just mean savings. Sometimes there's additional costs associated with that as well. Lastly, and then I'll just kind of pause to see if there's questions or we can move on. We aren't immune in school budgets to inflation. I've talked about that in previous iterations of this meeting. We're seeing, if you see an increased cost for milk at the grocery store, the district sees inflationary costs too. And that's something that we need to continue to be wise on both ends, both on the expenditure budget, but also what we're requesting of people. When we see inflationary impacts at the school level in our expenditure budgets, we also have to recognize how a higher request is going to impact an increase is going to impact homeowners or property owners, at a greater level because they have inflationary increases. And that's why I'm happy to say we're maintaining 102 mills. We aren't going to see an increase, minus reassessments that aren't in our control. But I'm happy to say that we're, committed to continuing that 102 mill levy that we've had really since 2013, 14, at least a relatively stable increase. But I think it's important that as a board, we continue to consider both sides of that. That we recognize an increase in mill in a high inflationary environment and tough economic times is a big ask for people. So I'm glad to see that and make the request that we aren't asking for that. So with that, I would stand for questions.
Any questions from the board? Gail?
I will make sure to get that for you as you dig in. Yeah, light reading to help you. Yeah, but it is a great, really finance facts. If you've never spent any time in there or in insights, in a correspondence to families with insights, how to access insights is coming. It's a requirement that we have. We'll be sending that out in the near future. But insights is a great place to look for data too.
Any other questions from the board? Jason?
Not necessarily a question, but an observation about the 60 mills. Like you alluded to, a total paradigm shift, or we're in a different world out of equity and adequacy, which is great. But then you use the term beholden to the state. I think there's going to be some interesting. When I hear that, I think whether it's a byproduct, an intentional byproduct or not of this, that will mean less local control to some degree. And like I said, intentional or not from that's happening. So I was just wondering, or that will happen. And I think this last legislative session, you saw some potential things come about, requiring sharing a superintendent. Do you have a vibe on any of that stuff? I mean, like I said, I'm not accusing anybody of like a agenda at the state level, that kind of thing, but that is a byproduct, I think, of this, and it'll just be interesting to see that play out.
No, and I want to take an opportunity to recognize our legislators. Our legislators do a great job of advocating and supporting education. They do. I'm very appreciative. We don't always agree, and not just our legislators, but legislators across North Dakota. But I think education is supported. Like I said, there's areas we disagree upon, and I think the difference, Jason, becomes when people don't understand the formula. When people think, when our legislators think, oh, we give 10,646 a kid, that should be enough. Plus, you have all this levy authority, and they don't understand how things work together, because if they did, they would understand how levy caps, as they are and where they are really problematic when you can't afford to give more at the state. My concern becomes if we have years again when we give 0 and 0 or 1%, 1%, and we know this from just the basics of the formula, if the per pupil amount stays the same, your actual state funding goes down. It's not a hold harmless, because our local contribution goes up. Our in lieu taxes go up. So you're actually seeing less money coming from the state. The locals just pick up more. And so when you're butted up against the cap, and I think there's a lack of awareness to how those things work together. And if we can improve that, which I think is going to be part of what superintendents across the state need to do, is to help educate our legislators on all of the intricacies of the formula, then they'll have a better understanding. But their hearts are good. They support us in education, especially in funding. But we need to do a better job of advocating for that and just educating on what that means. And I think when we frame the discussion around adequacy and what our local contributions are to that, and they understand what they actually fund and how it's different between Watford City and Jamestown and Grenora, they'll get a better sense of what that is. And I think we just need to empower them with information.
Jamie?
Do you have a number or percentage what our elementary schools have been declining, the enrollment in that is?
So in my time here, it's decreased about 100, 110 students on average. If you look from a K-5 standpoint, we were really using 1,000 as a target. We didn't get there in my very first year here. But that was kind of our planned target, or expected target was right around 1,000 K through 5. And that's closer to like 850, 860 now. And I think once we get through, and we're looking at class sizes, our largest elementaries get in, right now are like at the 160 range. Our newest, like our kindergarten classes, are closer to the 120 to 135s. So we're going to see a difference that is eventually going to, and our graduating classes are much larger. We've seen changes in what the other alternatives in the community are expanding grade levels. That shifts some of the loss too, that we just need to recognize and plan around. Answer your question.
Good discussion. Any other questions from the board? All right. Well, good news for our taxpayers. They won't be seeing this year an increase on the school portion of property taxes, but we just want to make sure our taxpayers know, and you talked about the school takes that job very seriously and tries to use our tax dollars as efficiently as we can. I'd like to thank Dan Tweeten and Aaron Roberts also, who sit on the Finance Committee. We spend a lot of time going over budgets and details, and so I appreciate their extra time as well as the rest of the board in their work. And I appreciate that you included challenges for the future for this board and future boards with budget, with declining enrollments. Some of our grant dollars and ESSER funding are going away, staffing shortages, and inflation. So I do appreciate you including that, because I think it's important also for our public to understand what some of the challenges that we're going to have in the future that are out of our control, but we're going to have to plan for them, and especially like declining enrollment that also impacts our facilities as well. So thank you very much. If there's no other questions or comments, if not, we're going to move on in our agenda. Oh, yes, and yes, we would like to also recognize that there isn't anyone here in the public, but we do know that many people do join on our Facebook, so we appreciate that access that's provided for them. So thank you. And no one was here to make comments during the hearing part. Do I close the hearing then? So essentially, yeah. So we're reached the end of the budget hearing information, but I do want to reiterate, if you weren't able to be here, weren't able to ask your questions, if you call the central office, Dr. Leck will be happy to share materials, information, links, and answer any questions that any of our public has. We want to make sure that our public, we want to be very transparent about our budget and our process and just the way the funding works. And so Dr. Leck is always available for that and enjoys talking.
I'm sure you couldn't tell, but yes, I do enjoy talking about it. But I'm happy to try to provide that in a way that is easily kind of translatable and understandable,
Yep.
hopefully.
And thank you for that. And again, feel free to reach out anytime. Okay, on our agenda item, under finance, item G and subsequent 1, review of final budget for the 2023 to 2024 school year, and that's informational, and the executive summary is there for your information. We'll bring that forward at the next meeting. And if there's any questions for Christy on this at this time. And then under H, there's a formula for determining tuition agreements. Any questions? Yep, Dr.
I
Leck.
just want to make a comment about the review of the final budget too. Of course, anybody can ask any questions if they have them here or later. Finance Committee did review and make that recommendation. Just a reminder that a recommendation for approval that's coming up at our next meeting was done through the Finance Committee as well.
Yep. Thank you for that. Under H, formula for determining tuition agreements is there for your information. Number 5, personnel. A, approval of extended contracts for the 2023 to 2024 school year. Number 1, Mike Dietz, Art. 2, Nate Purcell, Business. 3, Lori Hare, Family and Consumer Sciences. Is there a motion? Motion by Gail, second by Melissa. We have a motion, a second, for approval of extended contracts for the 2023 to 2024 school year. Number 1, Mike Dietz, Art. Number 2, Nate Purcell Business. Number 3, Lori Hare, Family and Consumer Sciences. Any discussion? Any discussion? Okay. There being no discussion, assuming roll call vote, all those in favor say aye. Aye. Opposed, same sign. Motion approved. Under B, we have approval of revised support staff wage schedule. First, is there a motion, and then we can have some discussion? Is there a motion? Motion by Dan, is there a second? Second by Gail. We have a motion and a second for approval of revised support staff wage schedule. And did you want me to speak to it, or did you want to?
I can. This was also brought up through the Finance Committee with the recommendation to approve. It's just recognizing we didn't have a position listed. You know, it was kind of a new position with the central office in the business department, and we just want to recognize the work that the person is doing, that their job is changing, taking on additional responsibilities. We wanted to make sure that they were compensated at the appropriate level. We didn't have a place for that, or we didn't have a category, so we wanted to bring it back to the board to make sure that we could get approval for that. Again, had a recommendation for approval from the Finance Committee.
Any discussion? Any questions? Any discussion? We have a motion and a second for approval of the revised support staff wage schedule. There being no further discussion, assuming roll call vote, all those in favor say aye. Aye. Opposed, same sign. Motion approved. 6, policies and procedures. A, approval of policies. Number 1, second reading of policy GBAA, teaching about religion. Is there a motion? Motion by Gail, is there a second? Second by Jamie. We have a motion and a second for approval of policies, second reading of policy GBAA, teaching about religion. Any discussion? Any discussion? There being no discussion, assuming roll call vote, all those in favor say aye. Aye. Opposed, same sign. Motion carried. Nothing under tuition for number 7 or 8 other. Items for future agenda. Are there any items for future agenda that the board would like to consider right now? Dan?
Jason and I are ready to bring the board resolution.
Okay.
Negotiations, it's been delayed here, so
Okay.
I think we'll be ready to go next time.
Next, you want me to put on next?
The budget agenda next time?
It
Okay.
won't matter that, either one of us has been gone, so.
Sure. Sure. Yep. Yep. So we'll plan for that for next agenda. And then, yep, and if you want to send it to Dr. Leck so we can get it posted. So, okay, sounds great. Any other items for future agenda? Any other items? At any time, if you have an item for a future agenda, please contact Dr. Leck or myself. Under meetings to be scheduled, A, school board regular meeting Monday, October 2nd, 2023 at 5:15 p.m. in the Thompson Community Room. And B, the North Dakota School Boards Association Conference, October 26th and 27th, 2023 in Bismarck. And if you're planning on attending that, please let Amy know so she can get registered. Reminder to complete your monthly superintendent evaluation, Section 3, Human Resource Management, and Section 5, Community Relations. There being no further business before the board, the meeting is adjourned. Thank you, everyone. Thank you.